Saïda stood in an endless queue, waiting, weary, for her turn to buy 2 loaves of bread, one for herself and one for her husband. In front of her was a young man with a Herculean build, blocking her view of the world. When she turned slightly, she found an old woman behind her, burdened with an age that seemed to stretch between 70 and eternity. The woman let out a faint sigh of annoyance, revealing her own impatience, exacerbated by her diminutive stature. To Saïda, the old woman seemed to grow taller as she herself shrank. She remained silent, like a nun in a cloister, tucking her head between her shoulders and gazing absently at the red curb to her right. A sudden whiff of animal dung reached her nose, though she couldn't determine its source. She looked around in all directions. In every direction, asphalt and concrete had devoured the land, while traffic and people swarmed between them. She sighed, a faint smile forming on her lips, masking the burden of existence. Her body remained tethered to the queue by a fragile thread, but her soul had drifted away to a spring morning somewhere in the Atlas Mountains, though she couldn't pinpoint the exact place. But the image of her mother lighting a fire with a pile of cow dung to drive bees away from the tea glasses lined up near Anor's oven convinced her that it must have been the courtyard of her grandfather's house, high up in the mountains of Toonfight. "Move along, girl! The line is moving, can't you see?" The old woman snapped at her, her rudeness wrapped in feigned politeness. Saïda didn't flinch. Her mother's mint tea had cast a delicious numbness over her. "Your tea! It's an elixir that could wake the dead!" She used to praise her mother whenever she watched her perform the sacred ritual of brewing ate. "And your bread," she whispered now, her cheeks flushed with memory. Even God himself would crave it. "Move, you little stump, move!" The old woman's voice rose behind her, now edged with open irritation. Saïda heard the woman's sharp words, yet she did not hear them. How many rugged paths had she walked since those days beneath the vast sky? The scent of bread baked over cedarwood and jujube thorns rekindled a fire within her, one she had thought city life had long extinguished. What cruel trick had fate played on her? She who once dreamed, from the vast plateaus of her distant mountains, of riding the clouds and caressing the sky. One evening she found herself beside a man, in a city neither of them had chosen. She had inherited nothing from her name, Saïda, happy, except for the fleeting joy of childhood among the majestic peaks of the Middle Atlas. She raised a hand to her lips as if to shoo away a persistent fly, when the old woman scolded her again, this time with a voice tinged more with mockery than anger. "Step aside, daughter of your mother, if you prefer stale bread." The old woman brushed past her, taking care not to touch her, as if she were a banana peel she feared slipping on. Saïda did not move, even after the old woman had passed her, even after the queue behind her grumbled with impatience. The scent of warm bread from the bakery mixed with the distant memory of her mother's firewood oven, teasing her senses, pulling her deeper into the past. The city had always been a temporary stop, she had told herself, a place to build a life, not to belong. But years had slipped by like grains of sand through careless fingers, and she was still here, standing in line, waiting for bread that was never quite as golden, never quite as warm, never quite as real as the loaves of her childhood. She sighed and stepped forward, finally reaching the counter. The baker, a tired-looking man with flour-dusted hands, barely glanced at her as he tossed 2 loaves onto the counter. She paid, took the bread, and turned to leave. The street outside was alive with the evening rush, cars honking, vendors shouting, the air thick with the smell of fried food and exhaust fumes. She pulled her scarf tighter around her face and walked, letting her feet carry her without thought. But her mind remained elsewhere. Somewhere in the folds of memory, she could hear her mother calling her name, could see her hands, rough and strong, kneading dough with practiced ease. Could hear the crackling of the fire, the laughter of children, the hum of the wind through the valleys of town fight. She turned a corner and stopped. Without realizing it, she had wandered to the edge of the city, where the buildings gave way to open land. A dusty path stretched ahead, leading toward a cluster of hills. For a brief moment, she imagined following it, imagined walking until she left the city behind, until she found herself among trees and rivers and familiar winds. A voice called her back. "Saïda!" She blinked. Her husband was standing a few feet away, looking at her with confusion. "Where have you been?" "I was waiting for you." She glanced down at the bread in her hands. It was still warm, but only just. She forced a small smile and walked toward him. "Nowhere," she said softly. "Just remembering." And with that, she followed him home, carrying with her not just the bread, but the lingering scent of a life she had almost forgotten.